In both biological and artificial neural networks, the fundamental process revolves around receiving inputs, processing them, and generating outputs. These processes are essential for everything from basic survival in biological systems to complex problem-solving in artificial intelligence. To understand the similarities between biological and artificial neurons, we can break down this process into key components: input plus weight, bias, and output. By exploring these elements, we can draw insightful parallels between how neurons work in our brains and how artificial neural networks, or ANNs, function in machines. Input plus weight. Biological neurons. Inputs. Biological neurons receive inputs from other neurons through their dendrites. These inputs come in the form of electrical impulses known as action potentials. These signals carry information from one neuron to the next, allowing the brain to process everything from sensory data to complex thoughts. Synaptic weights. The strength of the connection between neurons is determined by synapses, where neurotransmitters are released. Synapses can either amplify or diminish the incoming signals based on their chemical states. This is similar to the concept of weights in artificial neural networks. In a biological context, the weight is influenced by the amount of neurotransmitter released and the sensitivity of the receiving neuron's receptors. Stronger connections result in a more significant impact on the receiving neuron, while weaker connections result in a lesser effect. Artificial neurons' inputs. In artificial neural networks, inputs are typically numerical values. These could represent anything from pixel intensities in an image to data points in a financial model. The inputs in ANNs are provided by the dataset or from other neurons in the network. Weights. Each input in an ANN is multiplied by a weight. Weights are parameters that the network adjusts during training to minimize the error in the final output. Just like in biological neurons, these weights determine how important each input is in generating the desired outcome. The training process fine-tunes these weights to ensure the network produces accurate predictions. Bias. Biological neurons, resting potential. Biological neurons maintain a resting membrane potential, which is the electrical charge of the neuron when it's not actively transmitting a signal. This resting potential is a key aspect of neuronal behavior, as the neuron needs to reach a certain threshold to fire. The bias, in this context, can be seen as the threshold potential that the sum of all incoming signals must exceed for the neuron to activate and send out an action potential. Threshold. The threshold level is influenced by the combination of all the signals a neuron receives. If the total signal surpasses this threshold, the neuron fires. If it doesn't, the neuron remains at rest. This binary firing process, fire or no fire, is similar to decision-making in artificial networks. Artificial neurons, bias. In ANNs, bias is an additional parameter added to the weighted sum of inputs. It acts like an offset, allowing the network to make more flexible predictions. Bias ensures that even if all inputs are zero, the neuron can still produce a non-zero output. This can be crucial for the performance of the network, especially in scenarios where input data might not always align perfectly with the desired output. Bias allows the network to shift the activation function and model more complex relationships between inputs and outputs. When the sum of inputs, modulated by synaptic weights, exceeds the threshold, the neuron fires an action potential. This is an all-or-nothing response, meaning the neuron either fires completely or not at all. Once fired, the action potential travels down the axon to communicate with other neurons or muscle cells. After firing, the neuron releases neurotransmitters at the synapse, which then bind to receptors on the next neuron, influencing its behavior. This output essentially serves as the communication link in the chain of neural signals that drive everything from movement to thought. The output of an artificial neuron is determined by an activation function. This function processes the weighted sum of inputs plus the bias to produce a final output. Common activation functions include sigmoid, ReLU, and tan. These functions introduce non-linearity into the model, enabling the network to learn and represent complex patterns in the data. The output generated by the activation function is then passed on to other neurons in the network or used as the final prediction. In classification problems, this output might represent the probability that a given input belongs to a particular category. The entire process mimics the decision-making mechanism in biological systems. In both biological and artificial neural networks, generating an output from a set of inputs involves transforming and weighting signals. In biological neurons, synapses and neurotransmitters modulate input signals, while in artificial neurons, weights and biases serve a similar role. The firing of a neuron in the brain is analogous to the activation function in an artificial neural network, with both resulting in outputs that influence subsequent neurons or decisions. Understanding these parallels highlights the elegant design and function of artificial neural networks, which are inspired by the complex yet efficient mechanisms of the human brain.